From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Off the coast of Venezuela, floating on a patch of the Atlantic Ocean, a chunky US Navy flotilla has gathered. At least 8 warships, a submarine, and all backed up by a fleet of fighter jets. And they're not doing nothing.
Tonight, the White House releasing this dramatic video of the U.S. blowing up a boat in the southern Caribbean.
Moments ago, President Trump posted on social media that the U.S. military carried out a second strike targeting drug cartels that he says were transporting illegal narcotics to the U.S.
Stop sending drugs into the United States. We knocked off actually 3 boats, not 2, but you saw 2.
The Trump administration say they're bombing drugs traffickers, hoping to stop cocaine and fentanyl, in particular, from moving up through Latin America to the United States.
The president is prepared to use every element of American power to stop drugs from flooding into our country and to bring those responsible to justice.
Is this the full story, though? Or might there be another motive?
This is undoubtedly a return to the worst days of gunboat diplomacy.
The story today: is Donald Trump after Venezuela's oil?
The palpable threat of having 8 warships and a submarine off the coast of Venezuela on this huge scale is overwhelming.
This is journalist John Bonfiglio.
I have covered Latin America for a number of years now, in excess of a decade.
There's been this amazing sushi brewing between the US and Venezuela. Take us back to the beginning of September. It was the 2nd of September. There was quite the incident.
I would take us further back, a year ago, summer 2024, when Russian warships visited Venezuela after undertaking drills off Cuba and in the Atlantic. Candidate Donald Trump at that particular point of time seems to have been particularly irked by that show of strength off the coast, that kind of classic not in my backyard sense, but also to have been given ideas by that deployment. And a few weeks ago, the USA moved a naval flotilla, a much bigger naval flotilla, now numbering 8 warships and a submarine off the coast of Venezuela to the southern Caribbean. Soon after this took place, the flotilla began militarily targeting small boats off the coast of Venezuela.
We just, over the last few minutes, literally shot out a boat, a drug-carrying boat, a lot of drugs in that boat. And you'll be seeing that and you'll be reading about that. It just happened moments ago, and there's more where that came from.
As far as we know, and it's difficult because we get this news ad hoc through Truth Social and X and not in any sort of formal manner verifiable by both sides, 4 separate skiffs have been targeted and blown up with a casualty rate of between 15 and 20 people. Venezuela say that these were small fishing boats operating in the area. The US maintains that they were vessels, organized vessels, part of a broader narrative of a transnational criminal organization that were moving drugs up through a variety of ports through the southern Caribbean.
And when you say targeting, actually people died.
Yes, blowing them out of the water, essentially.
And the US says what? They were drugs traffickers and there were drugs on the boats.
Ostensibly, they say that this is to combat drug trafficking led by Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's so-called Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, which the USA is a Venezuelan government-run criminal organization which moves cocaine from Colombia at scale up through the Caribbean and into the USA to destabilize the United States society and the country.
We've recently begun using the supreme power of the United States military to destroy Venezuelan terrorists and trafficking networks led by Nicolas Maduro.
Today, the Department of Justice and State Department are announcing a historic $50 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. Maduro uses foreign terrorist organizations like TDA, Sinaloa, and Cartel of the Suns to bring deadly drugs and violence into our country.
It's important to be clear, I think, that there is no serious analyst that believes that the Cartel of the Suns is actually an existing, functioning criminal organization. It just isn't. It could have been, these likely are fishing vessels going about their business, but in all probability, they're also moving drugs at the same time. So they're not necessarily conflicting truths. And this is, I think, also a relevant point because, as so often in Latin America, both things can be true at once. The Dominican Republic say they have recovered in the region of a ton of cocaine from one of these targeted vessels, which would indicate that drugs were being moved through the area, perhaps not by a professionalized group, but certainly that were on board one of these vessels.
So it's not this enormous organized cartel with enormous links to the Venezuelan government, but it is certainly the movement of drugs which the US would like to stop.
Undoubtedly, the Venezuelan government is not at the arrow tip of a transnational criminal organization that structurally controls the region and moves drugs, in particular cocaine, up through the country, through the Southern Caribbean and up to the USA. That is just not the case. The Venezuelan government is undoubtedly self-serving, corrupt, illegitimate, but it is not a transnational criminal organization. It just isn't. Are drugs moved through the Southern Caribbean? Undoubtedly, yes, but in an ad hoc, freelance kind of fly-by-night way. The estimates are that 7% of Colombian cocaine moves up through the region in that way.
And having an issue with that as the United States is one thing, but actually attacking those boats and killing those people is another. Why did the Americans not just arrest them? I mean, why has this happened, do we think?
I think this is all about Trump's negotiating, if you want to call it that, strategies. I think his instincts are to press, metaphorically, the nuclear button as an opening candidate. He wants everyone to pay attention. He doesn't just want to achieve an aim, but he wants to send a message of what he's capable of. And I think instilling terror is a central part of this. And I would extend that to not just what's happening in the Southern Caribbean. I think it's the same strategy that is taking place in terms of deploying the National Guard in Democrat-run cities, in terms of how ICE is operating in a sort of an extrajudicial manner in the USA and threatening to deport people. And it is all about generating this space, which makes people not even just think twice, but not even contemplate doing something that Trump doesn't want them to.
And it's interesting to use the word terror because Donald Trump would say these drugs traffickers are terrorists. And I think he's even designated them as such, hasn't he?
Yeah. So this is also really interesting because the drug narrative plays to his audience. If we're talking about regime change, if we're talking about military aims, if we're talking perhaps about economic strategies overseas, that's not going to play in the same way as saying that this is to protect America's youth from drugs. As regards his policies, he secretly signed an executive order a few weeks ago at the Pentagon, which allowed for military engagement on foreign soil against designated terrorist organizations / overseas cartels, which hypothetically at least allows a legal framework domestically for these sorts of actions to take place.
Domestically, but not internationally.
As many people have said this week, emphatically not internationally, outside of a conflict zone. The rules-based order and protocol says that you can only kill people if your own life is under threat. That up until that point, of course, you can detain them, you can stop them, you can arrest them, but lethal force is not allowed.
You mentioned already that the Venezuelan government, you said they were illegitimate and corrupt. But tell me a bit more about them and Nicolas Maduro as well, the president. I mean, how corrupt, how illegitimate?
So, I mean, elections are stolen across the world. Generally, there is a level of professionalism to how elections are stolen. There's sort of some cloak and dagger stuff, so there's some subterfuge. But the way that the Venezuelan authorities in this particular administration, the Maduro administration, have undertaken it in the recent past is palpable, it's amateurish, and it's plain for all to see, to the extent that even Maduro's regional allies have called them out on it and said that it's an embarrassment. In particular, during the last presidential elections, the Venezuelan voting system is actually quite an up-to-date voting system, and you get tallies that emerge really quickly, polling station by polling station. Those disappeared. They still haven't been released now. The opposition gathered something like 60 to 70% of those polls, those sort of de facto numbers, in which obviously Maduro lost by not even a close margin, a substantial margin. Additionally, of course, you've got these militias that roam Venezuela, in particular Bogota, has sort of clamped down on dissent. There's been arrests and detentions of significant numbers of opposition leaders. The candidate who actually won the last election had to flee the country. The other major opposition figure is in hiding. It's unquestionable that the Maduro regime is illegitimate and has feathered its own nest in order to maintain its position. So this is why Maduro is entrenched, because everybody he has around him, if he goes, they go too. And it's not that they just lose power, they're then going to be held up for judicial processes and to be accountable for all manner of abuses, including detentions and extrajudicial killings in the country.
And he's been in office a good long while, hasn't he? So all of this is bedded into the kind of political and social structures.
Yeah, he's part of a Chavista regime, which runs now into its third decade, which began with Hugo Chavez, which was the self-declared anti-imperialist at the time, and actually, for a time, really did transform Venezuela. They're very different figures. They share sort of the same politics, but then Chavez died of cancer in the region of sort of 12, 13 years ago. Maduro was his anointed successor, but had none of the political skills, none of the charisma that Chavez had, all the background. And so Venezuela has gradually, over a period of time, really run itself into the ground. Remember that Venezuela was one of the bread baskets of Latin America not that long ago. And since, during Maduro's tenure, we've seen inflation reach 1,000,000% on occasion. And as a result, Venezuela has lost a third of its standing population in what is the biggest internal movement of people in the history of Latin America.
Wow. Having said that, though, being an illegitimate president who attacks opposition and rigs polls is not necessarily a barrier of entry to being friends with Donald Trump, famously. Fans of the North Koreans and the Russians. What is his beef with Maduro, though? Why is Donald Trump taken against him when he hasn't so many others?
So I don't think that it's specific to Maduro, and I don't think it's specific to dictators. I think he likes a strong man, and I think he likes a right-wing strong man. So if you look at the region, he's not a fan of Cuba. He's not a fan of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. He's definitely not a fan of Maduro in Venezuela. In terms of right-wing dictators, again, if you look regionally, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, he of the famous mega prisons, right-wing, he's a big fan of him. I also think that Maduro's illegitimacy actually gives him an entry point. It allows for him to push the envelope in that particular place because he thinks some people are actually going to ally with him based on the possibility of regime change.
So if we've got US military assets there in the region, what are the Venezuelans doing in response? Are they meeting fire with fire?
So the Venezuelan response undoubtedly is bombastic. And we have actually had flyovers by Venezuelan jets very close to US military vessels, which then elicited the response from the United States that should this happen again, these aircraft will be shot down. Now, in parallel, especially in the last couple of weeks, you've actually had a really toned down private Nicolas Maduro, who's been pliant. He wrote to the US administration, to Donald Trump, in the last few days, requesting a meeting to lower the temperature, which has been unilaterally rejected.
We have seen this letter. Frankly, I think there were a lot of lies that were repeated by Maduro in that letter, and the administration's position on Venezuela has not changed.
So you've kind of got this sort of double policy making at the moment, of course, on the one hand for a domestic audience, and on the other hand, in terms of, Nicolas Maduro knows what's at stake. And even if not by intent, he is worried that this could lead to his downfall.
Still, though, it seems like quite the tinderbox around Venezuela, all this Venezuelan military might and American just bobbing out there.
That is the worry. It's very difficult to know. This has been a bad year for analysts. It's very difficult to analyze conflicting situations, U-turns, often policy that is at odds with itself. Important to say that actually these strikes have taken place so far in international waters off the coast of Venezuela, but not in Venezuelan waters. So there is that sort of that gray area then in terms of sort of sovereign space. But the worry is that a warship, a jet may get something wrong, people die, and it forces both groups into a protracted series of events, which then gets out of control.
John, we're talking about Venezuela and the United States and the incredible situation we have at the moment, where, as you were explaining, there's this almost sort of American armada lurking off the coast. Are people in Venezuela worried about this? Do they genuinely think that the US might invade or something similar to that?
It's kind of conflicting, because I think there is a worry, but there's also hope. I mean, Maduro's regime is not liked. It is undoubtedly illegitimate and has brought millions of Venezuelans directly into poverty. The fear is that nobody knows what is going to happen next. There is no established protocol. Of course, we know that Trump is at the head of this, and being sort of consistent or faithful to a narrative is not necessarily in his playbook. So the worry, if you are a resident, a citizen of Bogota on the streets today, is that you're going to get caught up in something beyond your control.
Yes, but not American boots on the ground or American ordnance flying into your country.
Ordnance is possible. I think ordnance is possible. I think bombing is possible. Strategic targeting, very much in inverted commas, because, what does that actually mean? Boots on the ground, I think, changes the domestic narrative for Donald Trump away from being drugs protection into being foreign intervention, which most of his base, as we know recently from Israel and Iran discourse, is not in favor of that whatsoever. And it's been a significant part of this, his policy making, to say no more forever wars.
But do we think that Donald Trump would still like to see regime change in Venezuela?
Regime change, if it happens, will be a side event. It is undoubtedly not a primary motivating tool for Donald Trump. I would put two issues at the top of the agenda. Oil is one, but also removing Chinese influence from the region. If we just look at trade, trade went from $9 billion in 1999 between China and Latin America to approximately $180 billion 10 years later by 2010. And then by 2020, went up to $315 billion. Trump undoubtedly has a fixed interest with removing Chinese influence from the region. And he is undoubtedly right in saying that China's influence in Latin America, or believe it to be wide-ranging, multi-level, and in theory at least, infrastructural and financial. Additionally, China needs oil. China is a net importer of oil, but sanctions have made this difficult. So it sort of goes about this purchase of oil from Venezuela through a series of sort of parallel strategies.
Yes. Is this maybe what is motivating Donald Trump? Oil, that great motivator in especially American foreign policy in the last few decades.
I would put China and oil as being the top two motivators in terms of this presence in the region. Venezuela has the largest known oil reserves on the planet.
Wow.
Currently, it is not allowed because of sanctions to sell to the likes of China, but China does buy, ships turn their transponders off. So undoubtedly, that is something which the Trump administration wants to keep a handle on. And at the same time, the other thing I would add to that is, despite international sanctions which prevent the sale of oil, Venezuelan sale of oil, there are currently, alongside the 8 warships and the submarine, there are currently Chevron tankers, US company Chevron tankers off the coast of Venezuela, also filling up with oil, taking that oil to the United States. Chevron says that it is in full compliance with all legal sanctions and is able to move this oil legally.
And there has been a tricky relationship between the US and Venezuela in terms of oil, correct me if I'm wrong. In the past, the US was an enormous customer of them.
Yeah, we live in a world which pays lip service to moving to a sort of a post-oil, post-fossil fuel context, but there is still huge demand for it. So control, direct control or proxy control of huge oil reserves is regarded as being key to any administration.
Just take us through then what happened with the sort of American, Venezuelan and Chinese dynamic of what has happened with this oil. US was the sort of main customer, and then how did that fall away and China partly fill that gap?
So I think we have to go again back to Hugo Chavez in 1999. He comes to power, he moves Venezuela to the left, lots of, actually based on the sale of oil and the high price of oil at the time, lots of social investment begins to take place in the country, lifting of people out of poverty. And actually Venezuela in the noughties, in the early 2000s, is actually one of the great international news stories in terms of sort of social transformation. But then the price of oil falls, we move into sort of a more militant rhetoric through Nicolas Maduro, and then there's a sort of a détente and then a distancing and an aggression between Maduro and the USA. And of course, sanctions begin to build up. So the USA stops being a trading partner, and China and Russia step in order to not just satisfy their own oil thirst, because China is a net importer of oil, but also to prop up the regime as a thorn in the side of the United States. And at that point, because of sanctions, China and Venezuela have to think creatively about how to move oil out of the country, which basically it happens in two different ways. Ships just straightforwardly turn off their transponders, so they can't be located in terms of where they are and how they move the oil, or there's this kind of ghost ship phenomenon where ships that have actually been decommissioned and in theory gone to scrap on foreign shipyards actually are still roaming the seas today as ghost ships, and they end up being supplied on the high seas and then take the oil to China.
Incredible. So do you think that part of this military standoff we've got between the US and Venezuela, nominally about the drug trafficking issue reaching the United States, how much of it do you think is also about Donald Trump trying to put pressure on, a great source of Chinese oil?
Yeah, I think it is about Donald Trump trying to put pressure. I think it's about Donald Trump expelling China from the region. I mean, his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said as much in Ecuador in the last couple of weeks. Marco Rubio said that they were interested in removing all extra-continental actors from the region. But of course, it is also about controlling that oil for a potential future domestic market.
And doing so at gunpoint, which is quite incredible. And we haven't necessarily seen, especially in Western foreign policy, for a while.
This is undoubtedly a return to the worst days of gunboat diplomacy, literally gunboat diplomacy, as we see these armed vessels off the coast of Venezuela. And Latin America has a long, tawdry history of these interventions. And it is not simply Venezuela that is worried about what is taking place in terms of this military buildup off its coast. The region is hyper aware that this could be the thin end of the wedge.
And I mean, not to be too parochial about it, but I mean, what does that mean for us here in the UK? Does it much affect us?
I think any act or event which leads to a complete fracture of established international norms, especially if led by the UK's greatest international ally, and this threat to the rules-based order is something which potentially affects everybody, undoubtedly. Placing whim, anarchy, and media sound bites as essential drivers of foreign policy and engagement on the world stage is undoubtedly a new landscape.
How do you see this spiraling or diffusing? Not to make you try and look into your crystal ball, but do.
It's important to remember that and not discount Donald Trump's ego in this. I think there's also a motivating force that he likes demonstrating his power and strength, and he likes having people bend the knee. That is the most likely outcome, that Maduro comes cap in hand, that he takes immigrants from the USA back home, that he receives them, that he grants the US exclusive oil development permits in order to maintain his uneasy hold on power in Venezuela. That's the path of least resistance, right, for both sides. Of course, however, there is the possibility of other things happening which leads directly to international conflict in the Southern Caribbean. It's also worth being clear and saying that if there is some kind of accelerated military intervention in the region, beginning with Venezuela, that is absolutely a Rubicon moment, that changes the panorama regionally and I think internationally beyond anything we've seen so far.
That is it from us today. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to get in touch with us at any time, thestory@thetimes.com is how to reach us. Today's producer was Micaela Arneson. The executive producer was Taryn Siegel, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.